Are you running for president?
What, Larry?
I thought Jonathan must be running for president. He's going to read off the teleprompter.
Oh,
Yeah. Probably couldn't work that either.
Okay, I believe we are now streaming live on Facebook.
Okay. So call to order. Pursuant to recently adopted amendments to the Illinois Open Meetings Act included in Public Act 101-0640, public bodies may, in certain circumstances, hold entirely virtual public meetings without a quorum physically present in any one location. On March 17th, 2020, Village President Levin issued a declaration of emergency pursuant to the authority granted by the Village Code, the Illinois Municipal Code, and the Illinois Emergency Management Agency Act to address the health threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. On May 29th, 2020, Governor Pritzker issued a disaster proclamation that declared in-person attendance at public meetings of more than 10 people at the regular public meeting location to be infeasible in accordance with the Open Meetings Act as amended by Public Act 101-0640. On June 15th, 2020, President Levin executed a written determination that given the ongoing emergency associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person meetings of the Village Board of Trustees, including the Finance Committee, are not practical or prudent at this time and until further notice. On June 26, 2020, Governor Pritzker issued a new disaster proclamation in Executive Order 2020-43 that declared in-person attendance at public meetings of more than 50 people at the regular public meeting location to be infeasible. In accordance with the governor's most recent disaster proclamation, President Levin's declaration of emergency, and President Levin's recent determination regarding meetings of the Village Board of Trustees, President Levin determined that in-person meetings of the Finance Committee are not practical nor prudent at this time and until further notice. Accordingly, this meeting of the Finance Committee is being conducted virtually with members participating through Zoom webinar platform. Village Manager Phil Corrali is in the Village Hall conference room as required by the Open Meetings Act. Can you take roll call, Phil?
I got to figure out how to use this thing. Trustee Vree.
Here.
Trustee Miller.
Here.
Trustee Rubin.
Here.
We have a quorum.
To help facilitate this meeting, I ask each member of the Finance Committee and staff to mute your lines if you're not speaking and unmute your line when you speak to help minimize background noise. Members of the public are muted and should remain muted during the meeting. Members of the public should not share their video. As required by law, I will ask for a roll call rather than voice votes on any agenda item requiring a vote. Okay, public comment. In accordance with the supplemental rule the board approved on April 16th, 2020, here's how public comment will be taken this meeting. The email address and telephone number designated for public comment for this meeting were published with the meeting agenda. This time I will ask Management Analyst Deputy Village Clerk Jordan Lester to read the public comments that were submitted prior to the meeting in compliance with the instructions that were previously published with the meeting materials. If a member of the public would like to submit a public comment during the meeting, please email your comment to glencoemeeting@villageofglencoe.org. Comments submitted during the meeting may be read at the end of the meeting. Written comments should be limited to 400 words. Management Analyst Lester, please read the public comments if there are any.
Trustee Vree, we did not receive any public comments in advance of the meeting.
Okay. All right. Now that I'm through all my reading. Consideration of the minutes. Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Roll call.
Trustee Vree.
Yes.
Trustee Miller.
Yes.
Trustee Rubin.
Yes.
All right. I didn't have a chance to see who was on the call, but hopefully Nikki's here. Nikki, can you present the monthly financial reports?
I am here. Thank you. Share my screen here. All right. Can everyone see the presentation okay? All right, perfect.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so just a brief overview of tonight's discussion. We will be going through, and I've just realized I've omitted the auditor here, so I apologize, Tim, but I will. we will get to you. We are going to start with tonight's treasurer's report, go through our normal operating fund highlights, personnel costs, and our cash flow projection and reserve monitoring tools. Also be reviewing the most recent update to the community investment program, and then we will be reviewing the preliminary audit results as well, and then end with the financial forecast. Okay, so diving right into the treasurer's report, we had talked previously about this being a fairly key month in terms of measuring the impact of COVID-19 and just really kind of watching our most economically sensitive revenues. And this did not disappoint. In terms of property taxes, our receipts are lower than the prior year, but we're at 66.9% of budget, which is above where we would be throughout the year. I mean, in terms of just being at 60% through the year. But it does appear that we have a small portion of our population that has taken advantage of the Cook County extension. So you may recall from previous discussions, only about 60% of homes in Glencoe have a mortgage. And with those, we were expecting, because of covenants and agreements related to mortgages, that those property tax installments would be paid on time, which would have been the normal September 1 due date. We did get a large influx of property taxes this month, but we do expect to see another influx in September, early October, just in line with that extended deadline. In terms of income tax, it is lower than the prior year, but this still has been relatively steady this year. We did see a small surge from the unemployment incentive that was given as part of the relief package by the federal government. We did see a small surge in the current month, and we're at about 68% of budget. So this revenue is doing pretty well considering the circumstances. Sales taxes are lower than the prior year. As you recall, this is received on a delayed basis. So this would be for sales that took place in May. And again, we are starting to see this revenue recover. We'll talk about this a little bit when we get into the cash flow projections, but page 16, packet page 16 does provide a little bit of detail of the prior year sales tax receipts as compared to this year. But
So
we are, oh,
quick
go ahead.
question. So on the summary page, it says stub year of 764,000 for sales tax and prior year of 507. Is that correct?
So this is what we have. That's a good point, and I should clarify that. So thank you for highlighting that. If you're looking at just the numbers that are generated out of the system, it looks like sales taxes is higher than last year. But what we're comparing is not apples to apples, because last year there was an audit adjustment that was done about this time of the year that's artificially deflating that number. So if we're looking at it on a cash basis, apples to apples, it's actually lower than prior year to date by about $146,000. So we probably should have put a footnote on the slide to indicate that. But you're correct. I mean, looking at it this way, it does look like it's higher, but actual receipts compared year to year were down. And that's also the case on utility tax as well.
Actually, what I would normally do for a slide like this is I'd put the unadjusted number there so you could see the actual difference, with the footnote saying, based on the adjustment for audited financial purposes, we show that number as 506. So when you're looking at the slide, you actually can see the real comparison.
Got it. And we have since changed our practice, so this will make the reporting a little bit easier out of the system. So it'll give us the actual cash receipts numbers throughout the year. But there is like a slight anomaly in the month of August. But the good news is that our sales taxes are starting to recover. So the current month of sales taxes was about $10,000 less than this month last year, which is much higher than what we were expecting. Any other questions on sales taxes before I go forward?
Yes, of that
Oh, go ahead.
relationship in recovery and sales tax, how much of it is due to the auto dealers and how much is due to other things like the restaurants function?
So that's a good question as well. We had updated sales taxes by category, and unfortunately my packet pages are cut off, but it's included in the packet. And if we're looking quarter to quarter, can I do this without changing anything? Let me see here. Yeah, that was lucky. Okay, so just looking at a quick look, our drinking, so the drinking and eating places category is down about $10,000. Automotive and filling stations is down about 100,000 for the quarter. So those are quarterly numbers. I should qualify that. So both of those appear to be performing relatively strong, despite what we might have thought. As far as how much of that is related to auto sales, I would say a fairly large percentage. Anecdotally, what we're hearing is that there is an aversion to public transit right now. And in addition to that, there's also many folks that are working from home. So the need for personal vehicles has gone up, and auto dealers have actually seen a fairly decent amount of activity. So that's benefited us from a sales tax perspective.
I think one other point, Nikki, if I might, that we are also starting to realize, obviously the report, Nikki's talking a little bit about presumptive numbers that we've received from the IDOR on the month of, for the month, what we will receive in the month of September, that we are seeing that climb back to at least prior year numbers are very close. Likely what we're seeing in the month of May and June is a bit of pent-up demand that is also being realized. As we know, half of March and all of April were pretty dismal months from an overall operating standpoint in town. So, it'll be interesting to see as the predictive numbers for the month of October come out as we get a month or so from now to see how things progressed in July. It's interesting to watch, but we still have 4 months of retail sales that will make themselves known to us over the coming 8 months, really. So it's I think as we continue to look at these numbers and they get updated and the data gets updated with the IDOR, we'll be able to have a better sense of how temporary or long-term they may be.
Thank you.
Great. Just a few other comments. Our permit revenues is still lower than the prior year, but it is at 47.5% of budget. Again, we'll get into this in the cash flow projections section, but we do still have a steady flow of permits that have been coming across the front counter and are in the queue. Utility tax is lower than prior year. Again, this is deceptive from the chart because of an audit adjustment that was done mid-year. But when you compare numbers apples to apples on a cash basis, it is lower than the prior year. And this year's receipts are at 62.4% of budget. So we are running a little bit higher than budget, but again, a little bit lower than what we might have expected compared to last year. The water fund is continuing to perform very strong, as we would have expected. We do have the first bills of summer usage included in these figures, so we are starting to see some impacts from irrigation. I know our Public Works Department is working with our contractor on the first phase of meter changeouts as well. So we do expect the accuracy of the new technology to help these figures as those begin to go through the billing cycles and those get changed out. In terms of the maintening funds, again, personnel costs are higher than prior year. However, we're only at 58% of budget. These expenditures are increasing because of cost of living and collective bargaining agreements, but we are seeing less overtime related to changes in how we've structured our work over the past few months. And also vacant positions that have been held vacant. Our motor fuel tax fund is performing strong, largely because of the Rebuild Illinois funds, receipts that are now reflected in there. And we've received both installments for this year. And as you may recall, the one capital expense that we had scheduled out of MFT this year was delayed, deferred until a future year. Okay, cash flow projections. We do have a few new figures here. As Village Manager Corrali mentioned, we have received some information from the Department of Revenue. They were a little bit slower this month than they have been in prior months. And we have received, at the time we published the report, we only had the sales tax number. Now we've also received the income tax number, which is positive. You can see that we're projecting to receive $67,000 this month, as opposed to prior year number of 51,000 and a budget of 44. So we are starting to see that incentive, the benefit from that incentive related to unemployment. And we are receiving timely payments, so that's also very good. And you can see the sales tax number there of 165. That's just about $10,000 less, a little bit less than that than prior year. We've also received the use tax number, which you can't see on this slide, but the current year projection for September is 32,785 compared to prior year of 23,144. So our use tax is continuing to perform well. I would be cautious to say that it's going to continue to increase. We do expect this to stabilize at some point, but it is projected to end the current year over budget. I think we've seen some positive impacts of that shift to online purchases, and have been fortunate that the state has continued to share some of that as well. The other item that I do want to highlight on this slide are the numbers and the figures in December that are highlighted in yellow. As we started to take a deeper dive following the last finance committee, we noticed that the system was allocating a heavier weight of the budget to the month of December. So we've adjusted back some of those projections to what we think would be more realistic based on what we're seeing. So that figure for sales tax in December, again, this won't be for sales that occur in December, so that would not be a holiday sales tax related number. It would be 3 months prior to that. That's been adjusted down, as well as income tax, just to be a little bit more in line with what we've seen in previous years and what we would expect to actually see in December. Just another couple items to note on the cash flow projections. The beginning cash reserve in all of the funds have been updated to the audited figures. So that has been a positive reflection on the cash flow projections. Personal property replacement tax, we do not have a current month distribution for the month of September. We don't have that figure yet, but that would be consistent with what we've seen in prior years. Sometimes that's rather erratic. This tax has been running above budget, but we have adjusted our projections for the remainder of the year down based off of information that we received from the Illinois Municipal League. We do expect the state to continue to divert these funds to the tune of what may be as much as a 28% drop in these distributions. So we have carried forward, that would be for the state fiscal year 2021, which runs from July to June. So that would be for the remainder of this year and the beginning of next year. So we've incorporated that assumption both in our year-end estimates that we'll be presenting to the village board as part of the budget, and also part of the new year budget as well. Again, use tax remains steady. We're projecting to end the year very strong there. Parking fees, included in the packet, we did make some drastic changes to the parking fees based off of what we're seeing. You know, again, anecdotally, if you've driven past our commuter lots, they're eerily empty. And we've seen this revenue drop off drastically, both from, you know, again, the aversion from public transit and that shift to work from home. So the outlying months of our parking revenue for the rest of the year, and based off of what we're seeing in terms of receipts, have been adjusted down by about 85%. That is 100,000, give or take, out of the general fund for that revenue that we've budgeted for the entire year. So that is, it is a hit that we are projecting in the current year, and then also projecting it to start to recover next year. But again, I think this is kind of a sneak peek in what we will start to see as part of the budget process, that we're going to have to predict some things that are going to be tricky. In terms of building permit revenue, we are projecting now that this might finish the year at about 250,000 below budget. You might recall from last year's budget discussions that we were expecting a significant uptick in new construction as part of the development of 1801 Green Bay Road, which does not appear to have happened or will be happening by the end of the year. So that is somewhat expected based off of the current change in events. The other item that I do want to go through are some of the corrections to the cash flow projection spreadsheet since we last talked last month. Last month, you can see where the total budget impact was being calculated, and that other revenue line item, which includes a host of things, but what we discovered was that there was a line item for use of fund reserves that was being included in this line item, but we won't actually be receiving cash against that. So it was artificially increasing the amount of lost revenue in the current year. So what we've done is back that item out of that other revenue line item, so it's a truer picture of what we expect to collect versus what we've budgeted to collect. So you can see that other revenue line item has gone down significantly, and a budget variance of about $64,000. Now the lion's share of that $64,000 is the places for eating tax that we did decide to defer into the 2021. That was budgeted at about $60,000. So total, with the adjustments, the corrections, now we're expecting about $642,000. Again, I have to stress that this is an estimate, and it will be largely dependent on what happens in the remainder of the year, whether or not the governor imposes additional restrictions or changes, and also about how our residents feel about patronizing businesses and whether or not that consumer perspective changes. So we will have to continue to monitor, and this number will likely change every month. So that being said, I do want to just touch on, you know, originally when we talked in April, our original projections was that we could lose as much as $1.3 million. And included on the slide are kind of some of the assumptions that we had taken based off of, you know, where we came up with that number, that we might see, you know, a decline in volumetric water because we did defer late penalties for a while. We did extend some due dates. we didn't anticipate that there would be a period of drought, which has obviously had a positive impact on our volumetric water. We did anticipate a drop in income tax, which we are starting to see, and obviously sales tax and building permits. So this is a figure that certainly is not outside of the realm, but we are starting to see the picture get a little bit brighter, at least in the near term. Okay, moving on to expenditures. Because of the cuts that we made in April, our expenditures are lower than both prior year and original budgeted numbers. We're at 47% of budget right now versus what we could be at 60. And we do expect that our expenditures will be well below budget because of those expenditure cuts that we made. The water fund, again, the beginning fund balance has been updated for the audit. And our water fund revenues do continue to perform strong. The only revenue that we're projecting to end under budget this year is meter sales, which you would expect at this point, considering that we are in the middle of a full-scale meter replacement, and we will be replacing meters in the entire village. In terms of expenditures, again, we do expect the water fund to end the year below budget due to several cuts that were made in capital projects. So we do expect to see a positive impact from that as well. And then our motor fuel tax, again, here, the audited number has been, the beginning fund balance has been updated. Motor fuel tax, we're really not seeing a major decline. You did see a little bit of that in the month of June, but it's still continuing to perform fairly strong despite the reduced amount of driving from remote work. We were expecting to see that drop a little bit more than it did. And then you can also see the offset from this other revenue, that's our Rebuild Illinois funds, of that $95,000. We have not received our first installment of our local fuel tax yet. We're expecting to see that at best later this month, more likely maybe sometime in October, depending on where the Department of Revenue is in terms of processing that. That did go into effect July 1. So those sales taxes wouldn't have been remitted until the month of August. And then that number hopefully would be available sometime this month or early October. In terms of cash flow projections and reserve monitoring, the fund balance picture has been updated. It is obviously much better based off of the changes that we've made to the report and also the positive addition of the fully audited fund balance targets. And most importantly, we are still projecting that we'll end this year at or above all of our fund balance targets established by policy. Okay, included in the back of the packet are several rates of change graphs. These have been part of the report for a few months now. Obviously, you can see the massive drop off in sales taxes. The receipt of sales taxes is obviously somewhat erratic, but by what you can tell from that top line, obviously very seasonal in nature, but we are seeing a slight decline for obvious reasons. Property tax has been relatively stable. Again, we're starting to see that slight decline based off of those folks that have taken advantage of the deadline extension. So that's something that we'll continue to monitor. Again, the next few months will be key in watching this revenue. Use taxes have continued to climb steadily. Again, I would be cautious to say that they'll continue to rise at percentages anything much larger than CPI on a projection basis, and we do expect to see this kind of level off there. But overall, that's been a positive revenue picture for the village. And at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions.
I don't have any. Anyone else have anything?
No, thank you.
No,
If it's okay with you, Jonathan, I'd like to turn over to Stella Nanos, our golf club manager, to talk a little bit about the golf club report.
Okay.
Okay.
And before Stella jumps in on that, just real quick, we're going to be adding this component to the reporting every month, just to give the committee an opportunity to get a little bit more aware of the golf club and how its finances are functioning, and give Stella a chance to just talk through some of the good and less than great things that are happening at the club. So we'll kick it to Stella.
Good evening. Everyone hear me okay?
yes, you're
Yes.
doing very well.
Okay.
Yes.
So just wanted to give an update on the golf course, financially speaking. This year, obviously, has been a year that we've never seen before. In the spring, there was quite a bit of anxiety looking at our numbers and wondering where we're going to end up, being closed for an entire month and being at 25% capacity. At the end of May, we were $190,000 short of our budgeted revenues. The last 3 months have proven to be the busiest in the golf industry in history. We have not only made up our $190,000 deficit, we are $132,000 over our budgeted revenue. So we had a $322,000 swing in 3 months. Wow, this is great. We should start spending money. No, not really. Obviously, the drought is good for the village. It's also good for the golf course. The weather this year has been excellent. Just to give you a comparison of how we can't really say this year is going to be now the new normal. Compared to last year, we're 6,000 rounds above where we were last year at this point, and we're $243,000 higher year to date compared to last year. So it's really very early to say that this year is going to, save the golf course and we could start building the clubhouse next year. The weather, the competition, we do have a golf course that's closed for renovation in the area, so we're seeing a lot of their play. And the COVID impact and demand is also, contributing to the astronomical numbers, which we can't expect that to continue. It would be foolish to think that. If you look at our balance sheet right now, in September, we're at the height of our balance sheet. Our NOI is budgeted to be positive for 5 months and to be negative for 7 months. This is the way the golf industry goes. So we're at our peak right now. The next 7 months going through until May of next year, it's a negative NOI that's budgeted and anticipated annually. So we will see a $445,000 deficit to our balance sheet right now. This is normal, and this is what the seasonality of the golf business does to our balance sheet. So we have some undue expenses, highlights or lowlights for this month. We did pay the Cook County Forest Reserve our $62,500, which is our minimum payment. That was hit in this month. The clubhouse has had a myriad of issues. Plumbing seems to be the issue of the month. We've spent over $10,000 in band-aiding our existing sewer systems, bathroom systems, toilets. This is kind of an ongoing process of just trying to keep that building band-aided together and operational. At this point, it's almost a daily, weekly occurrence that something's breaking over there. So the fact of the fundraising is always coming into play here. We are moving fast forward with our fundraising. At this point, all of our paperwork is in line, and This week we'll be trying to recruit a couple of members to the board. We are in our final stage with our professional fundraising service, Campbell and Company. They are going to be conducting some interviews to test our campaign, which you saw, I believe, last week in the Friday report. So they're going to be testing out our campaign piece, and that is the last stage that we have with them as far as this component of phase 1 of the professional fundraising services. So phase 2 is going to be up to us to create a board, have a functioning operational board that helps us move into the next stage of actually asking people for donations. So that's where we are right now. On paper, we look great right now, but we know we're anticipating quite a bit of expense coming. Not to mention, we did defer a lot of our capital expense that was planned this year due to the unknown from early in the spring. So we had deferred about 40% of our capital expense, which is also going to come back as a necessity that we're going to have to spend. So that's kind of where we are right now. Happy to answer any questions.
When do you expect to get to phase 2 of the fundraising project?
Well, the phase 1 is going to be complete by the end of this month, and that includes those external interviews. We have not engaged the professional fundraiser for phase 2. This is something that we were anticipating on taking on in-house. The phase 2 portion that was, I guess, given a bid on from our existing fundraiser is a $95,000 phase, which we did not want to engage in. We may have to revisit that and see if we can peel off some pieces of that to project us forward. But at this point, the board should be taking on this work along with staff.
So they should be starting it this fall still?
Yes, it should start in October. If you're speaking, I can't hear you.
Oh, no, that's it. I was just, and I guess the other part of my question really is any idea how long that takes, but it might depend on whether we do it entirely in-house or get the professional help.
And the professional help is only guidance. They will not do the actual ask for money. They do not do that. That will be our board's responsibility. So as quickly as this progresses depends on the board members and how eager and invested they are in our program and how willing they are to put the work in, because there's quite a lot of work to be done.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Anything else?
I would just emphasize, based on our past studies and things, that we need to think about how do we help the golf course in getting out its message that this facility is beyond its useful life and that we really do need to get this project going and get a new clubhouse so that it can function and continue to be an important piece of the village for the next 100 years.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stella.
Sure.
I don't have my agenda in front of me because I've got a full screen of, oh, CIP, all right, way to go. Nikki, if you want to go through.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to hand this over to Assistant Finance Director Denise Joseph, and she's going to give us an update on our community investment program.
Good evening, everyone. Just a few items of note in this month's CIP report. A quick update on the parking system improvement project. This is moving forward and scheduled to be completed in October. All the hardware has been installed. That includes the pay station, the LPR cameras in the squad cars, and handheld ticket writers. We are now finalizing all the software integrations and anticipate complete testing in the next few weeks. The other item of note is the water plant beach access ramp wall repair. If you recall, this was previously recommended to be placed on hold in May. However, based on some competitive bid results, as well as the deteriorating conditions of the wall and stronger than anticipated revenue performance, staff is recommending to proceed with this project this fall. On the agenda this Thursday evening, the board will be asked to approve a cost sharing agreement with the Glencoe Park District. This agreement includes a reimbursement to the Park District for 50% of the cost of the retaining wall repairs. So this would cost the amount not to exceed $32,275 would be the village's share in that project. So at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions. That concludes my report on the CIP update.
I don't have any.
Okay.
Anyone else?
No, thanks, Denise. No questions.
No, thank you.
Okay. Moving on to our audit.
Okay, this
audit
is
here,
this
or
is me
you-
again.
Oh,
I'll take it. Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so I am very pleased to report that the village has completed our annual audit process for the fiscal year ended February 29th, 2020. Our final CAFR report, which is our comprehensive annual financial report, reflects positive results overall with a net position of $53.8 million, which is an increase of $787,000 over last year. Included in the packet was a memo that shows some of the growth in our unassigned fund balance and our operating funds. As has been a topic of this committee and many budget discussions, the village has worked very hard at building its financial reserve up from $2.5 million that was, many years ago, up to approximately $6.2 million in the general fund that we have today. Which is critically important, especially when we're encountering economic crisis that we've seen from the global pandemic or what could occur from many other reasons. Just a few notes on the actual audit process and compilation of this report itself. As you can imagine, this was an extremely challenging year, both from a staff perspective and from our audit perspective, our audit firm, trying to conduct the majority of this work remotely. Our preliminary field work was originally scheduled for March 25th. As the committee will remember, we did close down Village Hall on March 17th. So we were able to conduct all of that field work. It did take a little bit more than a day, but we were able to do that electronically and find some efficiencies in our process as we went through this. Our final field work occurred from May 21st to May 29th. That was the original schedule. This was all conducted remotely again, and that ended up taking a course of several months to locate everything we needed, get everything scanned in, get everything back and forth with the auditors, go back and forth with questions and such. So all of this work has led to the production of our required filings. These are typically due in August and September. We did have to request an extension for the Illinois Comptroller's report just to make sure that everything was filed timely. But the reports that you see here, it's not just the comprehensive annual financial report. We also have our required debt disclosure reporting that we have to do every year. There's a very in-depth Department of Insurance report that has to be filed on our pension funds. And also, again, the Comptroller's report, which is essentially a summary of our comprehensive annual financial report. Joining us today is Tim Gavin from Lauterbach and Amon. So he's going to provide a little bit more of an update for you, but just a brief overview. I know this committee has met Jamie Wilkie in previous years. She's presented as our audit partner. And then I would also just like to mention our other audit team members, Ann Van Voren, who's the principal on our audit, and Morgan Stanisuski, who is our senior associate. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Nikki. Would you like me to share my screen to get the CAFR up there?
Sure, if you'd like. Go ahead. Let me see if I can stop sharing here. Hold on. Thank you.
All right.
There we go.
That look okay? Just
Perfect. We can see. We can see, yes.
Okay. So anyway, thank you for the intro, Nikki. Nikki summed it up very well. To say that this was a unique year is a bit of an understatement. We have had a lot of challenges to navigate this year, and under the circumstances, we were thrilled with the cooperation and efforts put in by Nikki and her team. So overall, considering the circumstances, the process did go pretty smoothly, and we were happy to get it wrapped up in a pretty reasonable amount of time. So what I've got up on the screen is the comprehensive annual financial report. I'm going to just kind of touch on some highlights of the report, and then I'll open it up for questions. As has been issued in the past, it is a comprehensive annual financial report, which is has some additional content that other local governments don't include in their reports. So again, kudos to the village for taking on the extra effort of putting together the additional content that makes up a CAFR. And a part of that process is submitting the CAFR to the GFOA for their certificate program. So the first thing I'll point out is the certificate is presented for last year's report. And we fully anticipate this year's report being compliant with the certificate award program, and you'll have a certificate for next year's report as well. The next thing I will mention quickly is our independent auditors report. Basically it's the product of our work, and at the bottom of page 8 is where we've issued our unmodified opinion on the financial statements, also known as a clean audit opinion. It is the highest level of assurance that we are allowed to give. And I always say, if you don't read anything else in this report, read the management's discussion and analysis. Several pages of mostly layman's terms, information on how the report is structured, some key financial highlights, and some narrative information on why some numbers have changed between last year and this year, some of the factors that have contributed to it, some factors that may affect future financial circumstances. So all in all, it's a very thorough analysis of the financial statements. It gives a great picture of what's going on. So again, if you don't read anything else, definitely read this section. In terms of financial highlights, I know Nikki mentioned total net position. I'm also going to focus a little bit on some of the fund level results. Pages 28 and 29, essentially the balance sheet of the governmental funds. You'll notice in particular, all governmental funds ended the year with positive fund balances, of which about 2/3 of the fund balance is about 2/3 of the general fund balance is unrestricted, meaning there are no third parties that can place any restrictions on spending of those resources. And in total, about half of the fund balance is unrestricted. A few pages later, the income statement of the governmental funds of the village. And again, across the board, positive increases in fund balance. For the general fund, it was a little over $1.1 million increase, and overall about a $2.8 million increase in fund balance. Moving along to the proprietary funds, these are your water and golf club funds. On their balance sheet, again, positive equity in total for both funds. The golf fund does have an unrestricted deficit of a little over $500,000. On an operating basis, both the water and golf club funds did see a net increase in net position in total of about $900,000, and that's both on a grand total basis and an operating basis. So excluding all of the sort of non-operating items, both of those funds did see an increase in net position. I'm going to skip past a lot of the note disclosures. I suspect most of you don't want me to go into a whole lot of details here, but what I am going to point out is the trend information regarding the pension funds. Several years ago, the new pension standards came out, and we changed up all the reporting for the pension funds, and that started the supplementary information regarding the contributions and the funding levels for the pension funds. And every year we add a year to that trend info until we reach 10 years. So more and more of these schedules become more and more useful to track the progress on how the village has funded the pension funds and how well the funding level has been maintained. So that's for IMRF, police pension, what's left of the fire pension fund, as well as the OPEB standards. Those are newer, so there are fewer years to analyze, but that's a great place to go if you want to kind of track how the pension funds have progressed. The last thing I want to point out from this report is kind of on the same topic, and that's toward the end of the report. And again, this is part of that additional content that requires a bit of effort on the village's part to present. So it's actually extremely useful, again, for analyzing how the village has progressed in different areas. And that's the statistical section starting on page 126. So there's several pages here of 10-year trend data on everything from financial results to the village's ability to issue and pay off debt, the village's ability to raise revenue, demographic and economic statistics, as well as some operating statistics. So again, I'm not going to go through anything in particular detail, but if it's a great place to go to get a bigger picture view on some of the trends in those areas. At this point, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that the board might have.
No question.
None for me. Thank you for the presentation.
None for me, thank you.
Just a quick one, if you're looking just at this page, what are restricted and unrestricted activities, and why does the number go way negative?
So the restricted, the term restricted is in almost all cases refers to funds that are restricted by third parties. So a great example would be something like your motor fuel tax. The state of Illinois says you have to spend that on road repairs and similar costs. So whatever's left over at the end of the year would fall into that restricted bucket. The large negative amounts of unrestricted, you can see that it started in 2016 and then progressed from there. That was the beginning of the new pension standards. And this was something experienced by many Illinois local governments. The new pension standards required not just quantifying the unfunded liability for pension funds that you're involved in, but also putting that on your balance sheet. So what most local governments found out is their unfunded liabilities were large enough, even for relatively well-funded plans. The unfunded liabilities were large enough to drive that net position number negative. I should stress this is at the government-wide level, which is on a full accrual basis. In other words, it's got a lot of those long-term items, capital assets, long-term debt, and those net pension liabilities. That is less budget-focused and more big picture. So these negatives that you see wouldn't be represented in the more fund level budget focused results.
Okay, thanks. No other-
And one other thing I would add to that in the business type activities, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but I think part of that unrestricted negative amount is also, let me go back, the golf fund, in that we have positive investment in assets for the actual course, but then we also have that large liability, that amount that's still due to the village. So even though you have a positive fund balance, a lot of that is non-spendable and it's invested in capital assets.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. One other note, if anyone is interested in a paper copy, if you'd like to spend your evenings reading the CAFR, we do have those available at Village Hall, but it is also available online in full text.
Nick, isn't it also true when we look at that nice big number, that reflects the fact that the state has artificially set a date by which the plan has to be fully funded. And in reality, if you were just running it the way you run a properly run pension plan, you would never fully fund it. We'd always be what would be the equivalent of about 20 years away. So in many respects, it is a misleading number that the standards now require us to show there. And so it's important that people that look at our financial records and things, such as our auditors, understand those things, which they do.
Correct. Yes, our auditors have a very good understanding. But yes, you are correct. I mean, that the pension number there, as our actuary did a fantastic job at last month's meeting, kind of describing, those numbers are largely based off of statistical tables. And what's difficult is each year, investment returns can vary from what we've assumed. Mortality, retirement rates, salary increases can all vary. So you're constantly playing that catch-up game. So really that calculation of that unfunded liability is based off of the best information that they have available to them, understanding that life will never go perfectly in line with what you're assuming. So it can be misleading in certain circumstances, yes. Are there any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Very good
Thanks,
job.
Tim.
And then now are we moving, there we go, to financial forecasts.
Perfect. All right. So we are moving into our first 5-year forecast with all calendar years. So hopefully this will be a little bit easier to understand for everyone going forward than a February 29th or 28th year end. As we have done in years past, our financial forecast focuses on our major funds, our general fund, our water fund, and our motor fuel tax fund. Not surprisingly to anyone, one of the most impactful factors that we're dealing with this year are the economic impacts of COVID-19 and the uncertainty surrounding the depth and the duration of that impact. Obviously, we're continuing to prioritize infrastructure improvements. We are planning to provide the committee with a full slate of recommendations related to our long-term CIP next month. So that will and is expected to modify this forecast slightly dependent on what recommendations the committee would like to move forward with. Also, we've talked quite a bit about some of the uncertainty with future state budget impacts. There have been already continued diversions of our PPRT revenue, dependent on kind of the elephant in the room of what happens with the state's referendum in November may further impact some of the distributions that we receive as a local government, most notably income tax, but also sales tax and use tax, PPRT. those distributions all run through the state government. So whether or not that referendum passes, those allocation formulas may change and we would have to adjust accordingly. As we were just discussing, we're also battling rising public safety pension costs. Some of that is due to changes in benefits that have been made by the state legislature. Again, that's completely out of our control. And also results that would differ from assumptions. So years in which we haven't achieved the full investment income return that we were planning for. Also years where we had retirements or disabilities that were not planned for. That all kind of rolls on into that ongoing cost and funding that unfunded liability. As part of the capital plan, we'll talk a little bit about debt financing and infrastructure needs. We have a large need for capital improvements, but we do need to talk about how we're going to fund those. So whether it's through a request from the community for a referendum bond or revenue bonds that would be funded through water revenues is yet to be determined. And also designing fee structures around costs, making sure that we're covering the village's costs as much as we possibly can through our fee structures. So a few highlights from the general fund. Probably the best thing here that I can highlight is that the forecast no longer predicts expenditures to outpace revenues. Couple caveats to that. We still have to finalize our capital improvement requests to the committee, so that can obviously change this number in terms of planned spend down of reserves for capital. And also you can see at the bottom of the slide, we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth. We have a placeholder for rising pension costs, and that can vary widely dependent on what happens. As we saw this year, the state, as part of consolidation at the last minute, also decided to enhance Tier 2 benefits, which is a significant cost to the village, and in some ways cost the village of Glencoe more than other funds, because we do have an unusual split of 50-50 of those officers that are in the Tier 1 plan and those officers that are in a Tier 2 plan. So we are a little bit more susceptible to any changes that are made to that Tier 2 because we do have such a large percentage of our employees that are part of that plan. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But before we get to that, just a few items of note on revenue. The Department of Revenue has given us their CPI allowable increase for next year. It's 2.3%. So as we have done in past years, the forecast assumes that we would be recommending that full 2.3%, which is just over $300,000 in property tax growth. As we've discussed in years past, we're also, we have a placeholder for sewer fees to continue to support capital improvements. You may remember that this year's increase was at 10%. Right now we have a placeholder at 5%, but that recommendation to the committee may change dependent on once we finalize capital improvements through the 10-year plan. We're also recommending to increase the garbage services fee for costs. That would be in line with the allowable increase to the property tax levy at 2.3%. And then we'll also be recommending some changes to the business license revenue, that fee structure. That's part of the strategic plan. That's one of the goals that we have set forth to analyze that revenue and alternate structures for that as well. So we do anticipate bringing that forward as part of the fee analysis. Overall, looking out through the forecast, as we've talked about, sales taxes and commuter parking, income taxes and building permits have all taken quite a hit this year. So we are projecting those revenues to begin to recover based off of what we're seeing today. That's, again, the best information that we have today. We may have to revisit that if things start to go south again or there's additional changes that we're starting to see that revenue scale back. So that is, those are assumed to begin to recover. And on the more minor end, use taxes and alarm fees are projected to be relatively stable throughout the forecast. On the expenditure end, we've already talked a little bit about pension costs and let's see, inflationary cost on commodities. This was a concern last year, and we are continuing to see upward price pressure on our commodities. So that is going to be a continuing concern as we move forward throughout the forecast. There are some things that we just don't have a choice in purchasing, such as road salt. So certainly there's some smaller items that we can scale back on, but some of those are a cost of doing business, and that will be a necessary expenditure moving forward. Expenditures, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but we are seeing upward pressure on salaries from our collective bargaining agreements, and evaluating our service levels in line with our salary levels. So as we see positions turn over through attrition and retirements, we have committed to the board that we will continue to evaluate whether some of those programs will be continued in-house or if there's opportunity for contractual costs as well. But again, nothing comes free. So we do have some escalators on the contractual costs as well throughout the forecast. So with all of this in mind, we do have some mitigation strategies kind of baked into this. As I've already kind of alluded to, we do have a full fee analysis forthcoming. That's planned in October of 2020 as part of the presentation of the draft budget. Full sanitary sewer fee projections in line with updated numbers for the CIP, and the places for eating tax, which is now scheduled to take place or be implemented as of January 1, 2021. As we've talked earlier, certainly our local businesses, especially our restaurants, have been impacted by COVID-19, but we are still seeing the willingness to patronize those businesses. So this is a source of revenue that will help alleviate some in the general fund. From an expenditure standpoint, we already kind of talked about salary versus contractual costs. One thing that I'd like to note on the pension costs, although we do expect our contribution to rise in the future, there is a large unknown of what the long-term impacts of the public safety pension consolidation will be. And there are many varying opinions on that. Obviously, the cost of combining, I don't know the number, I'm sure Larry knows the number of how many pension funds we have statewide, but I'm sure it's in the 4 digits. But we do expect there to be a cost to combining all of these individual funds and consolidating them together. So we could actually see an increase in our pension costs before we start to see a savings there. That being said, the number that has been projected in terms of savings just on investment management fees is significant, and the ability to take advantage of the economies of scale in terms of investing and hiring a professional investment team to manage all these funds together is also significant, which is what we have seen in stark contrast with the IMRF model. The IMRF model is what our non-sworn employees that's the pension fund that they're enrolled in. And by contrast, that is one of the best funded pension funds in the country. So that is, obviously the model that they're going after. So we do anticipate to see savings at some point in the future. We just don't know how soon in the future. The deadline for consolidation is out in 2023. As of right now, assuming that does not change. So we would expect to start to see savings maybe towards the end of the forecast or slightly outside of that time frame. Okay, moving into the detail of the actual forecast itself. And I apologize, it's a little small on the screen. But the full detail is also in the packet. The beginning fund balance here is significantly higher than what you would have seen in the monthly treasurer's report. That's because for financial forecasting purposes, we do include the amount of reserves that we're holding at IRMA. Again, for anybody watching or new to this discussion, our IRMA is our risk management pool that we participate in for our property and casualty insurance. For each year that we have positive claim experience and we are contributing more in premiums than what we are costing the pool, we're allowed to accumulate reserve funds. And those are funds that are expendable. Typically, the policy of the village has been to utilize those funds for safety related projects. We've recently modified that policy to allow us to utilize some of those reserves to offset our premium costs or claim costs as well. We did reduce the village's deductible last year to help control some of those costs. But we are still paying a significant amount out of pocket. Going through some of the highlights on the screen, we've been using the Congressional Budget Office projection for CPI. So you'll see the property tax levy reflects the full allowable amount of an increase for 2021, which will be the 2020 property tax levy. And the out years are also increased by that percentage. We are seeing sales tax begin to recover, but you'll see in the out years, we're reflecting a relatively slow rate of growth that's projected at 1%. Again, dependent on the makeup of the community and whether or not we receive additional sales tax producing businesses, that could be modified going forward. Income tax, we're also projecting to start to recover back to normal levels. And again, you know, the big caveat there is dependent on what the income tax structure looks like going forward. So that could be an unknown for a while. We are projecting utility taxes to decline. That is what we have been seeing in the current year and consistent with what we have projected going forward. In terms of building permits, again, we are projecting to end the year less than budget, and then starting to recover in 2021 and beyond. So in some of those out years, 2022, 2023, we are assuming several new construction permits that will be included. That being said, we do have in the current year about 87 small permits in the queue, yet to be determined whether or not those will all, and Dave can correct me if I'm wrong, if those will all be settled by the end of this fiscal year. But several of those are some new construction permits. So we are still seeing a steady flow of activity, albeit slightly reduced. In terms of telecommunications tax, also expecting that to slightly decline over the years, again, consistent with what we have been seeing in previous years. Use tax is projected out at CPI. Again, we're not expecting anything crazy here, but that could be varying slightly depending on what happens with the state of Illinois. You will see parking fees significantly lower than what they have been previous years. We're investing significantly in an automated system, which should make the collection of these fees much easier, but it is unknown at which rate, or at what rate, I should say, commuters will start returning back, or if they will return back to normal. So we do have a significant dropout projected for the current year, and outward from there in 2023, 2024, just kind of stagnating there. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong on that, but in terms of PPRT, as we've discussed already, also projecting some declines in that revenue as we go forward. We do think that's going to continue to be a target of the state legislature as it has been in the past. And in terms of the remaining revenue, all kind of projecting those to be relatively stable. On the oh, yep.
Yeah, real quick, if we can just jump back to the last slide. I do think one point to make for the group is development of the Hoover estate is not something that we've necessarily baked numbers in, on 29 new residential building permits, which is what we would anticipate. And I think to some degree, that's been done because we did have conversations last year about designating those funds for specific purposes and specifically debt service potentially. And so as we move forward, we have taken a very conservative viewpoint on that, and that may be a further discussion that we bring into the budget discussions coming up in the next few months. But I did just want to make that one point real quick, that we haven't baked those numbers into these projections, and we've done that purposefully because I think we should have a broader discussion about what could be in the neighborhood of $1.5 million worth of revenue over the coming 5 or so years that we may want to avail ourselves to use for specific purposes. So sorry, Nikki, I didn't mean to jump in on here.
Thank you.
I had one question also. Just could you remind us what the more major components of the other revenue category at the bottom are?
So that is made up of a number of categories. Other violation revenue, so any of our parking tickets, our places for eating tax, the full amount would be in there. Other miscellaneous permits, the other permits, the only permits that we're showing here are building permits, but we do have a variety of other things. Business licenses, liquor licenses. I'm trying to think what else I might be missing here. Any other user fees that we would have, those are relatively minor. Let's see. Let me see if I can pull our financial report here.
Actually, that's fine. I certainly get the flavor of it. I appreciate that. Thank you.
And to come back for 1 second to comment a little bit more on what Phil was saying. Originally, when we were first considering what to do with the income for building permits from the Hoover estate, when we were pre-COVID and things were increasing rationally, we were thinking those extra dollars that will come only one time, so to speak, because we'll have the estate and then we won't have other big developments like that, that we could devote those to taking part of the cost of our 10-year CIP. Once we got into COVID, not knowing where our revenues are going, it made sense to say, rather than making decisions now to segregate that out, we may need to use that as backup for other things, and therefore we need to really go back and look at it and make a rational decision based on all the factors on where to put that revenue as it comes in over the next few years. So it was important for us to realize we are really sort of now re-examining something we had examined before, but that's why the budget looks the way it does right now.
Thank you. And one other thing I would note on the revenue slide before I go forward is obviously we're moving out of a stub year into a calendar year. So some of these numbers will appear to jump drastically and some of them will appear to be relatively similar, and that's just based off of the seasonality of our revenues of what's received between the months of March and December and what actually will come in January and February. And the same would be true on the expenditure end. So we've talked a little bit about expenditures in terms of salary and benefits.
By the way, that's why Nikki always refers to January and February as sort of a cool time.
It is a slow time. I think Stella would say the same for her. So we have talked quite a bit about salary and benefits, so I won't belabor that point. But again, we are assuming some increases here in relation to our collective bargaining agreements, and also mitigating that number slightly by what we have in terms of an attrition factor, understanding that there's a cost or cost savings from turnover, and also some anticipated retirements. Let's see. We've talked a little bit about the outward projected increases in commodities and services costs. We have an annual escalator in there to accommodate for some of our service contracts. Community grants right now, there's a placeholder that is just held steady, dependent on what comes out of the committee recommendations through budget discussions. And then also the police pension number, again, we have that 5% escalator. One note on benefit costs, we have continued to evaluate the cost of benefits that the village provides, are continuously looking at structures for the benefit plans and whether or not there are areas in which we can identify savings. So that is also kind of included in the calculation of this forecast as well.
One aspect, Nikki, if I can, before you go on, also, I just want to point to when we look at the police pension contributions, and as you see in calendar year 21, there's the projection of about 2.5 million or so in contribution. If you pop back one slide and you look at what we are able to generate from our levy, our property tax levy, you see police pension there is capped at 1.3 million. So we are making up the difference elsewhere in a revenue stream in order to meet those obligations. That continues to be, and as you can go back to the expenditure slide, Nikki, just as you see the progression, even with a relatively modest increase in the coming out years, that chasm between what we're able to levy and what we are responsible for funding becomes more and more significant. So that will be an area that, as we look at our overall expenditures, we'll continue to push and drive some of the decision making that this and future boards will be making. But that's also a point that as we further dialogue about home rule or other alternatives that may be available, there may be opportunities to adjust what we're able to levy for that purpose, as opposed to perhaps capital purposes and others. So just something to be thoughtful about, and to kind of tuck into your brain as we have these conversations this year and into the future. Sorry, Nikki.
No, that's okay. That was a great point.
I had one other question, just maybe you touched on this and I just missed it, but why the significant drop in commodities, or why the significant blip up in commodities this year?
That's a good question. I'm going to have to look at that one. What's in there?
Gary, I think you asked that before, and I recall that we had some answer, but I apologize, I'm forgetting it.
That's okay. There is something in there that
We really stocked
not
up on
gonna
road
use.
salt this year.
that may have something to do with the contingency that's budgeted,
I think that's what
that
it
we're
is.
just projecting. It is. It is the contingency, because when I was preparing this, I wanted to show that it would be spent, just to make sure that the numbers came out correctly. And originally it was included in 2021 and projected outwards, and I almost had a heart attack because obviously that number projected out is extremely large. So that is what that is. So that was a good question.
All right, thank you.
And then the other thing that I do want to point out, since we're on the slide, is we do have, going through each line, we're projecting continuing a positive operating budget. And then we've separated out this line item for projected capital that would be funded out of the general fund. These are placeholders. We're still reviewing these numbers right now. So obviously this would change the underlying projected fund balance based off of what we present to the committee next month. But I do want to point out that our projected fund balance is probably, for the first time in a long time, actually projected out to be above the reserve policy. So that's a positive change.
Is the reserve policy is a percentage versus 2.5? Is that right?
The higher, correct, or the lower of the two? I'd have to.
Is it the lower?
It's the lower of the two.
The lower of the two.
Yeah, because as our total operating budget, the actual total operating expenditures, goes from, call it 18-ish million a year on a full annual basis to almost 20. The 2.5, I think future boards are going to have to consider where they want to set that number.
Gary, actually, I think to your point, I think I misspoke. I think it's the higher of the two. It's a minimum of 2.5 million or 15%, whichever is higher. So it does index out as the budget grows. But you're right. Whether that floor needs to be raised is a question we may want to look at for futures.
Yeah, because at 15%, you're pretty much, give or take a few dollars, you're there.
Right.
You're at your limit.
Right. The other thing.
But it's still better than it had been in terms.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yeah. And that assumes that we're still taking money from the general fund and making significant capital expenditures with it. So.
And that was what I was just going to point to. I think, we know into the future that there are not insignificant capital needs that have been supplemented by the general fund. As those needs grow and we look at the types of funding opportunities, those are also going to come into play. The question, to some degree, it's the discussion we've been having about sidewalk snow plowing as a service provided by the village. It's not so much the operating cost of the service, it's the capital cost of the service. And so those dialogues, as we've talked through it, that was a significant part of the discussion with outsourcing garbage collection. We had $1.5 million in rolling stock replacing itself every 7 or 8 years. And so looking at those growth numbers up against the operating side, it's not always the operating. Sometimes it's the other pieces that tie back to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, any more questions on the general fund? Okay. All right, so moving on to the water fund, just a few highlights here. As we've done in years past, we're continuing to recommend water rate increases pursuant to the study. Just as a reminder, this is something that we did undertake after discovering that our water fees were much lower compared to other communities and much too low to support the capital needs of our system on an ongoing basis. So in line with the study, we are again recommending and including in the forecast the assumption that both volumetric and fixed rates will rise 8% again in calendar year 21. And again, this is something we'll have to analyze every year, particularly as we start to progress with our full-scale replacement of water meters, and just be able to fine-tune the measurement of that. On the expenditure level, that being said, we do have a significant amount of capital replacements that are projected out in the CIP. In terms of the forecast timeframe, we have about $12.6 million in water main replacements that were calculated in there as a placeholder. Additionally, have a placeholder for $5 million elevated water tank in calendar year 2022. Not necessarily that it's going to be done that year, more so just a reminder that that is something that is on our radar and is part of the joint study with Winnetka as well. In addition to that, there's also $7.6 million in production system and critical plant improvements. Again, this does not include any replacement of the water plant. This is just repairs and improvements that are needed to continue our water system to produce as it does today. As we have in the current year, we will be proposing that infrastructure be funded through a combination of water revenue bonds and accumulated fund balance. Again, those water fees are projected to increase and support not only payment of capital improvements through fund balance, but also through debt service payments as we move forward.
One other point to make real quick there, just to add to Nikki's comments, I think as we begin to see the fruits of the new metering system take effect over the coming couple of years, there may be some question at that point about the water rates in future years and whether they need to rise as much as the plan projects that they may. I think once we have improved accuracy in metering, we may find that our revenues as they exist may sustain more than we would have anticipated. Keep in mind the rate study was completed back in 2017 and implemented that year. So as we progress through this, we will continue to take a look at those projected rates that are at least in this rate analysis projected to increase through 2027. So just another thought to drop into your brains.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the water fund. Again, we've kind of summarized quite a bit of the capital improvements, the placeholders that were included down here. Volumetric and fixed rates are both projected to increase over the life of the plan in accordance with the rate study. Again, that could change dependent on what we see in terms of revenue. Meter sales are obviously expected to taper off there. We're hoping, really hoping, that we will not need to continue to replace them at the same rate that we have been prior to undertaking this full-scale improvement. There is a placeholder in calendar year 2022 for additional alternate revenue bonds. Again, that's just a placeholder pending final recommendations. We do expect, dependent on how far, excuse me, the village contractor gets this year in terms of replacements, we do expect the project to carry over into 2021. So you'll see in 2021, excuse me, the use of bond reserves of approximately $1.5 million.
Nikki,
And that's what we're estimating today.
Nikki, excuse me, but just the beginning balance number, the footnote 1, is that just a leftover footnote from the other chart that should have been deleted?
Yes.
The footnote, actually the footnote 1,
Yeah, that's general fund.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
And actually it's not leftover. It's actually referring to the fact that each one of these models includes expendable fund reserve. So this would just be the water fund expendable reserve. The IRMA reserve is actually spread between the general fund and water fund as well. So that reserve, the water fund does own kind of part of that number.
Oh, I see. So in other words, this number includes a bit of the total, and the general fund included the bulk of the total, so the majority.
Correct.
Okay.
You've got it.
And none of those do not otherwise appear when the other reports we get, general fund balance report doesn't include the gross amount of about $1.4 million that's currently sitting there.
That would be
It's
excluded.
just sort of an off the book asset.
Oh, that's a scary thought.
In a sense, I mean,
yeah.
it's a footnote, it's something like it's like an off the book liability. So before, depending upon reporting as to whether or not you just had to footnote it or throw it on there, like leasings.
It would be in an asset in the CAFR when
right.
at that full accrual level, but it would not be in the unrestricted fund balance level because it's technically held by another entity. So that's why we add it back in for the forecast, just so that we can see it. Awesome. That was a great question.
It's a good problem to have.
Oh yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, so similar to the general fund, I think we've talked at length about salaries. Similar assumptions here in terms of the outgrowth and the offset with attrition and anticipated retirements. Same with benefits. Largely here, your pension cost that's associated here is related to IMRF, Social Security contributions. And then we do have the outlier escalators in both services and commodities. We have baked in some debt service payments here based off of the issue that was done this year, and also kind of anticipating an issue in 2022, understanding that we'll have a revenue here, but then we'll also have the offsetting expenditures as we start to pay that back. And again, the water fund capital is just a placeholder there. So one thing to note is there is a negative fund balance in the water fund in the outlying years. So obviously, before we get to this point, this is something we'll have to discuss in terms of how capital is going to be funded, whether or not we need a larger bond issue or different fee structure or different priorities on our capital projects as well. So really just meant to be kind of a warning flag here of something that we need to monitor as we go forward in terms of our recommendations.
One of the things that we'll also advise that is if there are opportunities that we are able to realize with Winnetka, we are, thanks to COVID, a little behind where I think we'd anticipated we would be in terms of being able to report back to the village board on the outcome of that engineering analysis of our two systems. And so as that kind of finalizes out and we bring that back to the board, those types of opportunities may also amend how those dollars look in the out years.
Okay, moving on to the motor fuel tax fund. And again, I think I didn't carry over footnotes here, but there is no fund balance of IRMA in the motor fuel tax fund. This is just unrestricted fund reserve here. In terms of projecting motor fuel tax out, we do have a slight escalator here based off of what we're seeing. And then also have baked in this the Rebuild Illinois grant funds. We do have a placeholder here for $600,000 in 2022 for a road program. project. That's kind of an outdated figure. I know our Public Works Department is working on a revised recommendation on that. As you recall, typically what the village has done is allow that motor fuel tax revenue to accumulate, and we typically do a larger road program every third year. Now with the Rebuild Illinois grant funds, obviously this was not anticipated. This will allow us to do a larger scale project. So we're currently evaluating some candidates for that funding, and we'll bring that forward in October. But that's definitely a good news story in terms of capital funding as well. Outside of the road program, relatively small maintenance expenditures are recommended in the out years, but again, a relatively healthy fund balance as we move forward. We're also including the local motor fuel tax at 3% or 3 cents per gallon. There's a placeholder for this. Again, we haven't seen the actual figures for this yet, so we may need to adjust that as well based off of what we're seeing. In terms of the debt plan, again, this is pending final CIP review, so this picture may change dependent on the recommendations and what the committee would like to move forward to with, but just kind of some reminders of our overall debt picture. Our current debt limit is $74.9 million as of tax year 2019. And we currently have $26.7 million in GO debt outstanding and a $2.2 million loan through the IAPA that was used for a water fund project. Our average annual debt payment is about $2 million. And the line that you see on this graph was the historic annual payment high. We like to use this as a measuring stick just to understand where we have been and where we are today by comparison. So we are still significantly below that level. And this would represent the amount of dollars that are passed on to the taxpayer through the property tax levy and would be mitigated by any funds that would be abated through the tax levy. So as you probably recall from our discussion on financial policies, we are recommending that debt payments associated with the 2020 water fund bond, water revenue bonds be abated. So we would be paying that debt service through water revenue. And that's obviously something we could do with other debt issues if the revenue in the general fund allowed. We have approximately $3 million remaining in our limited tax authority. We did use just over 1.5 of that for the Tudor Court project. So the 3 million would be representative of the amount that is left over, certainly a financing tool that we would have available to us. And this chart has not yet been adjusted for the refunding of the 2012 A bonds. We can adjust that after the bond sale that occurs on Thursday, but we do expect that to generate some savings for our taxpayers once that bond sale goes through. Are there any questions on debt before I move on to pensions? Okay, I feel like I need to give you a precursor, like a rating for the next slide, because I don't want to have anyone have a heart attack, but I apologize for this. Just bear with me. Okay, so pension funding. So this is why we had some big red estimates earlier, and we're kind of talking about this throughout the memo because there is a significant unknown in terms of how this could be going forward. The forecast currently has escalators of 5% in the out years, and really where that's coming from is if you look at the last 10 years of pension contributions, that's where we've been in terms of an average annual increase. There are years that it went down, there are years that it went up. Again, it all depends on the experience that the fund has, how we do in terms of investment funding, investment returns, and how all of the other assumptions fall in line with what actually happens in real life. That being said, our required contribution for 2021 is $2.5 million. That's a 14.8% increase from the prior year. As we talked about last month, really the primary driver of that are those tier 2 benefit changes, and also that investment miss. So even though we did generate a positive investment return for the year, it still was shy of that 6.5% target that we have. Since 2007, our contributions have increased by 144%. Obviously, this is a combination of things: investment returns, enhancements to benefits, that are difficult to predict. I'm sure there are some folks that predicted the tier 2 benefit changes, but there's many others that did not see that coming. So it's difficult to predict what might happen in the out years, but you can kind of see from this chart where we were at in 2003 compared to where we're at in 2021. So this is a big unknown. And depending, because of the compounding nature of this in a financial forecast, the results can vary drastically. So if using a 5% escalator, we start in 2022 at 2.6 million, we end 2026 at 3.2. And that can range, if we use higher percentages, assuming that we've increased approximately 15% from the prior year. If we use that going forward, 2022 would be 2.9 million, and then in 2026 would be 5. These figures aren't mitigated by any savings that we would generate from pension consolidation. So obviously, these figures can change drastically dependent on the outcome of that. But this really, the erratic nature of pension funding and how much it's increased over the past 10 years, past 20 years, is really why we're recommending that the committee discuss with the actuary a formal funding plan to see what we can do to control that cost and really level that payment out over time to start paying down that unfunded liability. Obviously, there's very little to nothing that we can do in terms of changes that will be made by the state legislature, but we do have full control over the assumptions that we use. So what we're working on with our actuaries is to create a model, a funding model of what we might change in our current process to gain a little bit more control over this and level those payments out over time. So that'll be something that we're working on. We probably won't see it this year, probably early next year, but certainly something that we would like to put in place before we do another financial forecast like this, just so we have a little bit better feel for what these contributions might do to our bottom line in terms of fund balance, and what would be, as Manager Corrali mentioned earlier, how much would be available from the general fund in terms of capital funding and other expenditures that the village needs to make over time. So I'm happy to answer any questions on this slide. Is everybody still with me? I hope. Okay, I'm sorry for this. I did tell you ahead of time. Okay. So in terms of next steps in the financial forecast, so any feedback that we received today will obviously be incorporated into the draft budget document. This document, the financial forecast as it was presented to you, will obviously need to be updated based off of the CIP recommendations that we're going to be making to you next month. And we'll obviously be coming back with a formal financing plan of how we propose to fund what we're recommending to you, along with any fee recommendations that would come along with that as well. And at this point, I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Just a couple of notes then, kind of looking forward to October. As we've mentioned, budgeting for next year is a bit of an art, and I should say a bit of science and a lot of art. What we are planning to do is to bring you a draft budget that does as good a job as it can of looking at what 2021 might look like, and with that, some alternatives that we can utilize either as the budget's approved or during the course of the year as we monitor how things are going from a revenue and expenditure standpoint. So that's what we're working through. The budget will probably be a little bit less detailed from the standpoint of all of the narrative that we generally include in the early editions of the budget, because we're really going to be focusing our efforts on looking at some of those alternatives and trying to, rather than spend a great deal of staff time justifying various expenditure programs in written form, to do that as part of our presentation in October. So the budget itself will probably be a shorter document than you're used to seeing in its first draft form. Once you get to December and you're being asked to consider the approval of the final budget document, it'll grow at that point. But we will focus most of our efforts on looking at the operating expenditures and looking at capital in October. So just a couple of things to be mindful of as we prep for that. We are going to encourage the whole village board to attend the finance committee meeting, and there may be 2 finance committee meetings depending on how much time we need to get through those budgets, but we may start the meeting a bit earlier and try to get through as much as we can in early October. So just something to look forward to as you're planning your schedules. The week of the October meetings is probably going to be one that you're going to need some extra coffee for, because Tuesday night's finance committee meeting will be long, and then we're anticipating the Hoover estate development on the village board agenda on Thursday the 15th. So for those of you keeping score at home.
All right. Any questions from anyone on this?
Yeah, Phil, did you say something about 2 meetings for this? Or do you mean 2 meetings in October, finance committee meetings?
Yeah, I'm sorry. What I should have said was it may overflow into the committee of the whole discussion time. We have done that in the past, you may recall.
Yes, okay, that's fine. I just was wondering if there's another night we should be.
No, not at this point. We'll try to keep it to the Tuesday and Thursday.
Phil's being optimistic. It could start Tuesday and we just go all the way through.
That is possible. That's true.
Let's shoot for that.
Yeah.
All right. Any other business anyone wants to talk about? Jordan, did we get any public comments during the meeting?
Trustee Vree, we did not receive any public comments.
All right. On that, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right. It's just 3 of us, so.
Yeah, we don't have to. I don't think we need to do a roll call. You're all saying yes. I can see it already.
Yeah, I'm definitely in favor.
Nikki,
Right, see everybody.
and to all of you that put all that together, thank you very much. A huge amount of work and